July 22nd, 1952. A Thursday evening in Manhattan. The kind of summer night where the heat didn't break even after the sun went down, where the air hung thick and still, where tempers ran short and violence felt inevitable. Inside a warehouse on the Lower East Side, in a neighborhood the Italians controlled like it was Vatican property, Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, stood alone in a room with 12 men who wanted him dead. They were Genovese soldiers, made men, the kind of gangsters who'd killed for less than a perceived insult. And their capo, a man named Salvatore Sally Boots Maranzano, had just called Bumpy the one word that was supposed to make him flinch, supposed to make him remember his place in a city where white mobsters thought they owned everything, including the right to disrespect. The room went silent. 12 hands moved toward 12 guns. Sally Boots smiled, expecting fear, expecting submission, expecting Bumpy to back down the way every other black gangster had backed down when faced with mafia muscle. What he got instead was 6 words. 6 words delivered so cold, so calm, so final that Sally Boots stopped smiling. 6 words that would echo through the underworld for the next 2 decades. 6 words that made the Italian mob realize they'd miscalculated what Bumpy Johnson was capable of. And when those words left Bumpy's mouth, everyone in that warehouse understood that someone wasn't walking out alive. New York in 1952 was a city divided by invisible borders, drawn in blood, and enforced by bullets. The 5 families controlled everything that mattered: gambling, unions, construction, the docks, politicians. They'd built an empire on the understanding that Italian organized crime was the only organized crime that counted. Everyone else, Irish, Jewish, black, Puerto Rican, they could have the scraps, the street-level hustles, the nickel-and-dime operations. But the moment anyone tried to build something bigger, the moment they tried to operate without permission, the Italians came down like a hammer. And for the most part, it worked. For the most part, people stayed in their lanes. But Bumpy Johnson had never been good at staying in lanes. He'd been running Harlem for over a decade, controlling the numbers racket, the heroin distribution, the protection schemes. He'd survived wars with Dutch Schultz, done time in Alcatraz, and come back stronger. And he'd done it without asking permission from the Italians. That was the problem. That was why Sally Boots had called this meeting, to remind Bumpy who really ran New York. Salvatore Maranzano was a capo in the Genovese family, a man in his late 40s with slicked-back hair and a face like carved stone. He'd killed his first man at 16, made his bones during the Castellamarese War, and climbed the ranks by being smarter and more vicious than everyone around him. He controlled the Italian operations in East Harlem and parts of the Bronx, and he'd been watching Bumpy's rise with growing irritation. The problem wasn't that Bumpy was successful. The problem was that he was too successful, too independent, too comfortable operating without paying tribute to the families. Sally had tried the diplomatic approach, sent messages through intermediaries, suggested meetings, hinted that cooperation would be beneficial. Bumpy had ignored him. Not out of disrespect, out of strategy. Bumpy understood that the moment he acknowledged the Italians' authority, the moment he paid tribute, he'd be locked into a system where he'd never be more than a servant. So he kept his distance, kept building, kept expanding. And Sally Boots decided it was time to teach him a lesson. The meeting had been arranged by a fixer named Benny Blue, a Jewish hustler who worked both sides of the racial divide and made his money facilitating conversations between people who'd otherwise kill each other on sight. Benny told Bumpy that Sally wanted to discuss territory, maybe carve out some agreements that would benefit everyone. Bumpy knew it was a setup, knew Sally didn't want to negotiate, wanted to humiliate him, force him into submission, maybe even kill him if he refused. But Bumpy went anyway, not because he was stupid, because he understood that refusing would be seen as weakness, and in the underworld, weakness was terminal. So he walked into that warehouse knowing the odds, knowing the danger, but also knowing something Sally Boots didn't. That some men can't be broken. Not with guns, not with numbers, not with slurs meant to cut to the bone. Some men are built different, and Bumpy Johnson was one of them. The warehouse was on Delancey Street, a cavernous space that smelled like motor oil and old wood, crates stacked to the ceiling, dim lighting from bulbs hanging on frayed wires, the kind of place where bodies could disappear and no one would ask questions. Sally Boots was waiting with 11 of his soldiers, all of them armed, all of them watching Bumpy like wolves watching a lone deer. Benny Blue was there too, standing off to the side, already regretting his role in this, already calculating how to distance himself from whatever was about to happen. Bumpy walked in alone, no backup, no visible weapons, just a dark suit, a fedora, and the kind of calm that only came from a man who'd already made peace with dying. Sally Boots didn't offer a handshake, didn't offer a chair, just looked Bumpy up and down and started talking. He laid out the situation, told Bumpy that Harlem was operating without proper oversight, that the families were concerned about independent operations cutting into their interests, that it was time for Bumpy to start paying a percentage, start clearing decisions through the proper channels, start showing respect. Sally said all of this with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, with a tone that made it clear these weren't suggestions. They were demands. And when Bumpy didn't respond, when he just stood there listening with that unreadable expression, Sally's smile faded. He took a step closer, got right in Bumpy's face, and then he said it. The word, the slur, the insult designed to strip away whatever dignity Bumpy thought he had, to remind him that in Sally's eyes, in the Mafia's eyes, Bumpy was nothing. Just another black hustler who needed to remember his place. The room went dead silent. The soldiers stopped moving. Benny Blue looked at the floor. Everyone was waiting to see what Bumpy would do, whether he'd swing, whether he'd reach for a weapon, whether he'd back down. Bumpy did none of those things. He just looked at Sally Boots with eyes that had seen more violence than most men could imagine. And then he spoke. 6 words. Slow, clear, final. You'll never make it out alive. That's all he said. 6 words that weren't a threat. They were a statement of fact, delivered with such absolute certainty that Sally Boots actually took a step back. And in that moment, the dynamic shifted, because everyone in that warehouse realized that Bumpy wasn't afraid, wasn't intimidated, wasn't playing the game Sally thought they were playing. Bumpy had just told a mafia capo, surrounded by a dozen armed soldiers, that he was a dead man. And he'd said it like he was commenting on the weather. Sally Boots tried to laugh it off, tried to regain control. He gestured to his men, made a joke about Bumpy's confidence, suggested maybe Bumpy didn't understand the situation. But his voice had changed. There was an edge of uncertainty now, because threatening someone who's supposed to be afraid doesn't work when they're not afraid. And Bumpy wasn't afraid. He was calculating. The soldiers started closing in, hands on their guns, waiting for the order. Sally was about to give it, about to tell them to take Bumpy outside and put a bullet in his head. And that's when the warehouse door exploded inward. Not literally, but it might as well have. 30 men poured in, black men, Harlem men, Bumpy's men. They'd been waiting outside, hidden, ready. And when they came through that door, they came with shotguns, Tommy guns, pistols, and the kind of cold purpose that made Sally's soldiers freeze. Bumpy had known this was a setup, had planned for it, had turned the trap around, and now Sally Boots and his men were the ones surrounded. The math had changed. 12 Italians against 30 Harlem enforcers, and the Italians, for all their reputation, for all their swagger, understood what the black gangsters from Harlem understood instinctively. That dying for pride was stupid when survival was an option. Sally Boots looked at Bumpy, then at his men, then at the arsenal pointing at them from every direction, and he made the only smart choice available. He told his soldiers to stand down, put their guns away, show their hands. The tension didn't break, it just shifted. Bumpy walked towards Sally Boots slowly, deliberately, until they were inches apart, and he repeated those 6 words, softer this time, almost a whisper. You'll never make it out alive. But then Bumpy did something unexpected. He stepped back, told his men to lower their weapons, told Sally and his soldiers they could leave, that this one time, this one moment, they'd get a pass. Not because Bumpy was merciful, because he was smart. Killing a mafia capo and a dozen made men would have started a war Harlem couldn't win. Not yet. But letting them walk out after humiliating them, after showing them they'd been outplayed, that sent a different message. That said Bumpy Johnson wasn't someone who could be pushed around. That said the days of the Italians dictating terms to Harlem were over. Sally Boots and his men left that warehouse in silence. No threats, no promises of retaliation, just the bitter understanding that they'd lost. Word spread fast. By the next morning, every major player in the New York underworld knew what had happened. Knew Sally Boots had tried to strong-arm Bumpy and gotten outmaneuvered. Knew that Bumpy had walked into a trap, turned it around, and walked out with his reputation enhanced, while Sally's was in tatters. The Genovese family held a sit-down to discuss what to do. Some capos wanted war, wanted to make an example, but the smarter ones, the ones who understood the changing landscape, they argued against it. They pointed out that Bumpy had handled it perfectly, had shown strength without causing casualties, had drawn a line without forcing them to cross it. And they recognized that fighting a war in Harlem against a man who commanded that kind of loyalty, that kind of tactical intelligence, would be expensive, and might not even be winnable. So the decision was made. Leave Bumpy alone. Let Harlem operate independently. Focus on other territories. It wasn't surrender, it was pragmatism. But in the streets, it looked like victory. Sally Boots never recovered from the embarrassment. He'd been made to look weak, incompetent, easily outmaneuvered. Within 6 months he was demoted, pushed out of his territory, given a do-nothing position that kept him away from real operations. He spent the rest of his life bitter, drinking too much, telling anyone who'd listen that he'd been set up, that the families had abandoned him. He died in 1967, forgotten, a cautionary tale about underestimating the wrong man. Meanwhile, Bumpy's legend grew. The story of the warehouse confrontation became part of Harlem folklore. People told it in bars and social clubs, embellished it, added details that might or might not have been true. But the core remained the same. Bumpy Johnson had stood up to the Mafia, survived, and forced them to respect boundaries they'd never respected before. The ripple effects lasted for years. Other black gangsters in other cities started pushing back against Italian control, inspired by what Bumpy had done. The 5 families, recognizing the changing demographics and power structures, started making accommodations, forming partnerships rather than demanding submission. It wasn't equality, not even close, but it was a shift, a crack in the foundation of Italian dominance, and it started in that warehouse on Delancey Street, with 6 words delivered by a man who refused to be anything less than what he was. Dangerous, strategic, unbreakable. Bumpy Johnson never talked about that night publicly. Didn't brag about it. Didn't use it for publicity. That wasn't his style. He just went back to running Harlem, protecting his territory, building his operations. But people noticed that after July 1952, the Italians approached him differently, with caution, with respect. They didn't try to push him around, didn't demand tribute, didn't use racial slurs in negotiations. Because they'd learned what Sally Boots learned too late. That the color of a man's skin had nothing to do with how dangerous he was. That underestimating someone based on race was a mistake that could get you killed or humiliated, and sometimes humiliation was worse. The old codes, the old assumptions about who held power and why, they were changing. Not because society was becoming more enlightened, because men like Bumpy Johnson were forcing the change at gunpoint. The warehouse incident became a teaching moment in the underworld. Young hustlers heard the story and learned that intelligence mattered more than numbers, that staying calm under pressure could shift power dynamics, that respect wasn't given freely, it was taken, strategically, with precision. And they learned that words, the right words delivered at the right moment, could be as deadly as bullets. You'll never make it out alive. 6 words that encapsulated everything Bumpy was. Confident without being reckless. Threatening without being crude. Final without being loud. It was the verbal equivalent of drawing a line in concrete and daring someone to cross it. And when that line was backed by 30 armed men who'd walk through fire for their leader, it became unbreakable. The Mafia never returned to challenge Bumpy in that way again. They did business with him occasionally, negotiated territory disputes through intermediaries, even partnered on a few operations where cooperation benefited both sides. But the relationship had fundamentally changed. Bumpy wasn't a subordinate to be managed. He was a peer to be negotiated with. And that shift, small as it might seem, represented something larger. It represented the beginning of the end of absolute Italian dominance in New York's underworld. It represented the reality that the city's criminal landscape was diversifying, that power was fragmenting, that the old hierarchies built on ethnicity and old-world traditions were crumbling against the reality of a new generation that didn't care about those rules. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, 16 years after that night in the warehouse. He had a heart attack in a restaurant in Harlem, surrounded by friends, still powerful, still respected. When the news spread, Even the Italian mobsters who'd once wanted him dead acknowledged his passing with a kind of grudging respect. He'd been a worthy adversary, a man who'd played the game at the highest level and never compromised who he was. The warehouse story was told at his funeral, repeated in the eulogies, used as evidence of his character. And in the decades that followed, it became legend. Proof that courage and intelligence could overcome numerical superiority. That standing your ground, even when outnumbered, even when faced with the most vicious organization in America, was sometimes the only choice that mattered. Sally Boots' use of that word, meant to diminish, meant to put Bumpy in his place, had instead triggered his own downfall. It had revealed the limits of mafia power, had exposed the arrogance that came from decades of operating without real challenge. And Bumpy's response, those 6 calm words, had become the perfect counter. Not rage, not violence, just cold certainty. The kind of response that couldn't be answered because it didn't invite debate. It simply stated a reality that Sally and his men were forced to accept, that they were in over their heads, that they'd misjudged their opponent, that they were lucky to be leaving alive. The old men in Harlem still tell the story about the night Bumpy Johnson walked into a mafia trap and walked out a legend. About the slur that was supposed to break him but instead broke the man who said it. About 6 words that changed the balance of power in New York City. And when they tell it, they always emphasize the same point. That respect isn't about being the biggest or the loudest or the most violent. It's about being the smartest, the calmest, the most prepared. It's about understanding that real power comes from knowing when to fight and when to simply make your enemy understand that fighting would be their last mistake. Bumpy Johnson understood that, lived it. Proved it in a warehouse on a hot July night when he should have died, but instead made the mafia realize they'd never return to challenge him that way again. Because some men can't be intimidated, can't be insulted into submission, can't be made to forget who they are, no matter what words are used. Bumpy Johnson was one of those men. And those 6 words made sure no one ever forgot it.